When my phone rang at 3 in the morning last Tuesday, I knew something was terribly wrong. After 68 years on this earth, you develop an instinct about these things. The kind of calls that come in the dead of night rarely bring good news. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what was about to unfold over the next 2 weeks. My name is Dorothy, and for the past 43 years, I've been the quiet backbone of my family's financial stability. When my husband passed away 8 years ago, he left me with a substantial inheritance in a family business that had been thriving for 3 generations. What he also left me with was a daughter-in-law who I thought loved me like her own mother, and a son who I believed would honor his father's legacy. How wrong I was about both of them. But let me take you back to where this nightmare really began, because the events of that horrible night in the hospital were just the tip of an iceberg that had been growing beneath the surface for months. You see, for the past year, I had been noticing small changes in my daughter-in-law Sandra's behavior. Little things that seemed innocent at first, but started forming a pattern that made my stomach churn with unease. It started with the business meetings I was suddenly no longer invited to. For over a decade, Sandra and my son Marcus had included me in every major decision regarding our family's construction company. I wasn't just a silent investor. I was actively involved in the day-to-day operations, handling the books, managing client relationships, and making strategic decisions that kept us profitable even during the toughest economic downturns. But somewhere, around last spring, those invitations stopped coming. When I asked about it, Sandra would flash that sweet smile of hers and say, "Oh, Dorothy, we didn't want to burden you with all the boring details. You work so hard already. We thought you deserved a break." At first, I appreciated what I thought was their consideration for my age and health. After all, managing a construction business is demanding work, and I had been feeling more tired lately. But something in Sandra's eyes, when she said those words, didn't sit right with me. There was a coldness there that I had never seen before, like she was looking through me rather than at me. Then came the changes to our weekly family dinners. For years, every Sunday evening, Sandra, Marcus, and their 2 children would come to my house for a home-cooked meal. It was our sacred family time, where we'd catch up on the week's events, discuss business matters, and simply enjoy each other's company. But gradually, those dinners became less frequent. First, it was every other week because of scheduling conflicts. Then, once a month, because they were too busy with new projects. When they did show up, Sandra seemed distracted, constantly checking her phone and cutting conversations short. She would barely touch the food I spent hours preparing, claiming she wasn't feeling well or had eaten earlier. Marcus, my own son, started backing up her every excuse, nodding along like a puppet whenever she spoke. The final red flag should have been when I discovered that my access to our business bank accounts had been restricted. When I tried to log into our online banking system one morning in September, I received an error message saying my credentials were no longer valid. I called the bank immediately, thinking it was some kind of technical glitch. What the customer service representative told me made my blood run cold. Sandra had submitted paperwork 3 weeks prior, claiming that I was stepping back from active involvement in the business due to health concerns. She had medical documentation, supposedly signed by my doctor, stating that I was experiencing early signs of cognitive decline and could no longer be trusted with financial decisions. The problem was, I hadn't seen my doctor in over 6 months, and I certainly hadn't signed any such documentation. When I confronted Sandra about this over the phone, her response was swift and calculated. She told me that she and Marcus had been worried about some of the financial decisions I had been making lately. She claimed I had been forgetting important meetings, mixing up client names, and making errors in the books that could have cost us thousands of dollars. Every accusation she made was a complete fabrication, but she delivered them with such conviction that for a moment I actually questioned my own memory. That's the insidious thing about gaslighting. It makes you doubt your own reality, even when you know the truth. But I'm not a woman who backs down easily. I demanded a face-to-face meeting with both Sandra and Marcus to discuss these alleged concerns. We arranged to meet at the business office the following Friday afternoon. I spent the entire week preparing, gathering documentation of every transaction I had overseen, every meeting I had attended, and every decision I had made over the past year. When Friday arrived, I walked into that office with my head held high and a folder full of evidence that would prove my competence beyond any reasonable doubt. Sandra was sitting behind the desk that used to be mine, looking perfectly composed in her navy blue suit. Marcus sat beside her, but he couldn't meet my eyes when I entered the room. What happened in that meeting still haunts me. For 40 minutes, Sandra systematically dismantled my contributions to the family business. She pulled out financial reports that I had never seen before, showing losses that allegedly occurred under my oversight. She presented meeting notes that documented my supposed confusion and erratic behavior during client consultations. The most devastating part was watching my own son nod along with every lie she told. This was the boy I had raised single-handedly after his father's first heart attack left him bedridden for 2 years. The same boy who used to tell me I was his hero, who promised he would always protect me the way I had protected him. When I tried to present my own documentation, proving that these reports were fabricated, Sandra calmly explained that my confusion was evident in how I was misremembering events and mixing up dates. She suggested, with what seemed like genuine concern, that I should see a specialist about my memory issues. The meeting ended with them graciously offering to let me remain as a silent partner in the business, receiving a small monthly stipend while they handled all operational decisions. They framed it as a generous retirement package, a way for me to enjoy my golden years without the stress of business management. I walked out of that office feeling like I had been hit by a freight train, not because of their offer, but because of the realization that the two people I trusted most in this world had been systematically planning to push me out of my own family's legacy. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and really thought about everything that had been happening. The missed dinner invitations, the restricted bank access, the fabricated medical reports. All of it suddenly made perfect sense. Sandra hadn't been trying to protect me from the stress of business management. She had been methodically removing me from a position where I could discover what she was really doing with our company's money. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the real revelation was still 2 months away. 2 months during which I played along with their charade, while quietly conducting my own investigation into what Sandra was actually doing behind closed doors. You see, when you've been managing finances for over 4 decades, you develop certain skills and instincts that don't just disappear overnight. I might not have had access to our business accounts anymore, but I still had connections throughout the industry. Vendors who had been working with our family for years, clients who trusted my judgment, and banking professionals who remembered when I was the one signing their paychecks. It took me 6 weeks of careful detective work to uncover the truth. And when I finally pieced it all together, the scope of Sandra's deception took my breath away. She hadn't just been stealing money from our family business. She had been using our company's credit and reputation to fund an entirely separate construction venture that she was running with her brother in another state. The fake medical reports, the restricted access to accounts, the systematic exclusion from business decisions. It was all part of an elaborate scheme to keep me from discovering that she was siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from our family's legacy to build her own empire. But even knowing all of this, I wasn't prepared for what happened that terrible night in the hospital, the night when Sandra's mask finally slipped completely, and I saw exactly what kind of person I had been sharing family dinners with for the past 15 years. Dinners with for the past 15. The call that changed everything came from Marcus himself, his voice shaking with panic in a way I hadn't heard since he was 12 years old and broke Mrs. Henderson's window with a baseball. But this wasn't about broken glass or childhood accidents. This was about his father, my late husband, Robert, who had apparently collapsed at the grocery store and was being rushed to the emergency room. I threw on the first clothes I could find and drove to the hospital with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. During that 20-minute drive through empty streets, all I could think about was how Robert had been feeling tired lately, complaining about chest pains that he kept insisting were just heartburn. I had begged him to see a doctor, but you know how stubborn men can be about their health. When I arrived at the hospital, Marcus was pacing in the waiting room like a caged animal. His face was pale, his hair disheveled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the frightened little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. He rushed to me the second I walked through those automatic doors. The next few hours were a blur of medical terminology, insurance forms, and endless waiting. The doctors explained that Robert had suffered a massive heart attack. They were doing everything they could, but the damage was extensive. We needed to prepare for the possibility that he might not make it through the night. I called Sandra immediately, because despite everything that had been happening with the business, she was still family. She was still the woman who had married my son, who had given me 2 beautiful grandchildren, who had sat at my kitchen table every Sunday for 15 years, sharing stories and laughter. When she arrived at the hospital 2 hours later, she wasn't alone. She brought her brother, Derek, a man I had met only a handful of times at family gatherings. He was one of those people who made you uncomfortable without doing anything specifically wrong, always watching, always calculating, always seeming to evaluate everyone around him for their potential usefulness. At first, Sandra played the role of the concerned daughter-in-law perfectly. She hugged me in the hallway, brought me coffee from the cafeteria, and sat beside me during the long stretches when all we could do was wait for updates from the surgical team. But I noticed something strange in her behavior. That night, every time a doctor or nurse approached us, she would immediately step forward, as if she were the primary contact person. When Dr. Martinez came out to update us on Robert's condition, Sandra positioned herself directly in front of me and started asking detailed questions about his prognosis, his treatment options, and what kind of care he would need if he survived the surgery. She was taking notes on her phone, documenting every word the doctor said, with the kind of precision you'd expect from someone planning something important. What struck me as odd was that Marcus, Robert's own son, seemed content to let Sandra take charge of these conversations. He stood behind her, nodding along, but not really engaging with the medical team. It was as if he had already designated her as the family spokesperson without consulting anyone else. Around 4 in the morning, when the doctors finally told us that Robert was stable but would need to remain in intensive care for several days, Sandra suggested that we should all go home and get some rest. She offered to stay at the hospital to monitor his condition and promised to call if anything changed. I refused to leave. This was my husband of 43 years lying in that hospital bed, and I wasn't going anywhere. But Sandra insisted that someone needed to be thinking clearly about practical matters, like insurance coverage, medical decisions, and business continuity. She kept emphasizing how important it was for someone with a clear head to handle these responsibilities. The way she said it made my skin crawl. It was the same tone she had used during that meeting in the office when she questioned my mental competence, the same subtle suggestion that I wasn't capable of handling important decisions. But this time, she wasn't questioning my business acumen. She was questioning my ability to make medical decisions for my own husband. When I told her firmly that I would be staying at the hospital, her mask began to slip just slightly. For just a moment, I saw something flash across her face that looked almost like annoyance. But she quickly recovered, smiled that sweet smile of hers, and said she understood completely. She would go home to check on the children and handle some urgent business matters that couldn't wait. What I didn't know at the time was that while Robert was fighting for his life in intensive care, Sandra was already implementing the next phase of her plan. She spent that morning not comforting grieving family members or handling childcare responsibilities. She spent it at her lawyer's office, discussing power of attorney documents and medical decision-making authority. Over the next 3 days, as Robert slowly began to recover, I started noticing more concerning changes in Sandra's behavior. She would arrive at the hospital each morning with a stack of paperwork, claiming it was business documents that needed Robert's signature once he was feeling better. She had also started bringing Derek with her every single day, which struck me as strange, since he barely knew Robert and had never shown much interest in our family before. Derek would sit in the corner of Robert's hospital room with his laptop, supposedly working on his own business matters. But I caught him several times, taking photos of Robert's medical charts when he thought no one was looking. When I asked him about it, he claimed he was just trying to research Robert's condition online to better understand what we were dealing with. On the 4th day, when Robert was finally alert enough to have real conversations, Sandra presented him with what she described as some routine business paperwork that needed his immediate attention. She explained that there had been some banking issues while he was in the hospital, and they needed his signature to resolve them quickly. I watched from across the room as Robert, still weak and disoriented from his medications, struggled to read through the documents Sandra had brought. She was sitting right beside his bed, pointing to specific sections and explaining what each form was supposed to accomplish. But something about her urgency didn't feel right to me. When I asked to review the documents myself, Sandra quickly gathered them up and said they were just routine administrative matters that didn't require my involvement. She assured me that Marcus had already reviewed everything and approved all the necessary changes. She said they were just trying to streamline some banking procedures to make things easier for when Robert came home. But Robert never made it home. On the 5th night of his hospital stay, his condition suddenly deteriorated. The doctor said it was another massive heart attack, one that his already damaged heart simply couldn't survive. By 6 in the morning, my husband of 43 years was gone, and I was left alone in a world that suddenly felt cold and unfamiliar. The next few days passed in a haze of funeral arrangements, condolence visits, and paperwork that seemed to multiply exponentially. Sandra immediately stepped in to help with all the administrative details, which I appreciated at the time because I was drowning in grief and couldn't think straight about practical matters. She handled the insurance claims, coordinated with the funeral home, and managed the endless stream of phone calls from Robert's business associates and longtime clients. She seemed to have an answer for every question and a solution for every problem that arose during those terrible days. What I didn't realize was that while I was grieving the loss of my life partner, Sandra was methodically consolidating control over every aspect of our family's financial empire. The documents Robert had signed in the hospital weren't routine banking forms. They were comprehensive power of attorney agreements that gave Sandra complete authority over our business operations and medical decision-making. The funeral service was beautiful. Robert would have been proud of how many people came to pay their respects. Clients he had worked with for decades, employees who considered him more of a father figure than a boss, and neighbors who remembered his kindness and generosity throughout the years. But even during the service, I noticed Sandra behaving strangely. Instead of grieving with the rest of us, she seemed to be networking. She was introducing herself to Robert's business contacts, collecting business cards, and having hushed conversations about the future of the company. She kept emphasizing that she and Marcus were committed to maintaining Robert's legacy and continuing his work. After the burial, when everyone gathered at my house for the traditional meal, Sandra pulled me aside for what she described as an important conversation about our family's future. She explained that Robert had expressed concerns before his death about my ability to handle the stress of running the business alone. According to her, he had specifically requested that she and Marcus take over the day-to-day operations to protect me from unnecessary burden during my time of grief. She presented this as Robert's final gift to me, a way for me to enjoy my remaining years without worrying about the complexities of business management. She said they had already spoken with our accountant and lawyer about transitioning the operational responsibilities to ensure everything would continue running smoothly. The way she explained it sounded reasonable and caring. After all, I was 68 years old, recently widowed, and emotionally devastated. Maybe it did make sense for the younger generation to take over the heavy lifting, while I focused on healing and adjusting to life without Robert. But something deep in my gut told me this wasn't what Robert would have wanted. Throughout our marriage, he had always emphasized the importance of my involvement in business decisions. He respected my judgment, valued my insights, and often said that the company's success was as much due to my financial management as it was to his construction expertise. The Robert I knew would never have made such significant decisions about our family's future without discussing them with me first. He certainly wouldn't have signed away my rights and responsibilities while he was drugged up in a hospital bed, barely conscious and fighting for his life. But in those first weeks after his death, I was too overwhelmed with grief to fight Sandra's version of events. I was struggling just to get through each day, to figure out how to live in a house that felt empty without Robert's presence, to make sense of a world where I was suddenly alone after 4 decades of partnership. So I went along with their plan, at least temporarily. I let Sandra and Marcus take over the business operations, while I focused on settling Robert's estate and trying to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. I told myself it was just a temporary arrangement, that once I felt stronger and more emotionally stable, I would reassert my role in the company. What I didn't know was that Sandra had no intention of this being temporary. While I was home grieving and trying to heal, she was systematically removing my name from bank accounts, changing vendor contracts, and restructuring the business in ways that would make it nearly impossible for me to regain control. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came about 6 weeks after Robert's funeral, when I received a call from our longtime accountant, Mr. Peterson. He wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss some irregularities he had noticed in the company's financial records. He said there had been some unusual large withdrawals and several new accounts opened that he wasn't familiar with. When I called Sandra to ask about these irregularities, her response was swift and dismissive. She explained that they had been making some strategic investments in modernizing their financial management systems. The withdrawals were for new equipment purchases, and the accounts were simply part of their efforts to streamline operations. She assured me that everything was properly documented and that Mr. Peterson was just being overly cautious because he wasn't familiar with their new approaches to business management. She suggested that his concerns were probably just generational differences in accounting methods. But Mr. Peterson had been handling our books for over 20 years. He knew our business inside and out, and he wasn't the type of man to raise concerns without good reason. When I met with him the following week, what he showed me made my blood run cold. Made my blood run cold. Over $300,000 had been systematically drained from our company accounts over the past 4 months. Money that should have been sitting safely in our operating fund had vanished into a maze of shell companies and investment accounts that I had never heard of before equipment purchases that Sandra claimed were essential for business growth had never actually been made. The invoices were real, but the equipment had been delivered to addresses I didn't recognize. Mr. Peterson spread the financial statements across his desk like he was laying out evidence at a crime scene. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he pointed to transaction after transaction that made no sense from a business perspective. Wire transfers to companies with names like Sunrise, Construction Solutions, and Premier Building Enterprises, organizations that didn't exist in any business registry he could find. The most devastating discovery was a series of loans that had been taken out against our company's assets. Sandra had used our pristine credit rating and Robert's reputation to secure nearly $500,000 in business loans from 3 different banks. The loan applications listed her as the primary business owner and me as a silent partner with diminished mental capacity. When I saw those loan documents, I felt something inside me break that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with rage. The medical documentation she had used to support her claims about my mental state was even more elaborate than what she had shown me months earlier. She had somehow obtained letterhead from my doctor's office and forged detailed psychological evaluations that painted me as a woman in severe cognitive decline. According to these fabricated reports, I was experiencing advanced dementia, frequent episodes of confusion, and an inability to make rational financial decisions. The documents described incidents that had never happened, conversations with medical professionals I had never met, and test results from examinations that had never been conducted. The level of planning and deception required to create this paperwork was staggering. Sandra hadn't just decided one day to steal from our family. She had been methodically building a case against my mental competence for months, maybe even years, laying the groundwork for what she knew would eventually become a complete financial takeover. But what hurt more than the stolen money was the realization that my own son had been complicit in every step of this betrayal. Marcus had co-signed loan applications, witnessed fraudulent documents, and provided statements to banks confirming his mother's declining mental state. He had looked those loan officers in the eye and told them that his own mother was no longer capable of managing her affairs. Mr. Peterson recommended that I contact the authorities immediately. What Sandra had done wasn't just unethical. It was criminal fraud on multiple levels. The forged medical documents, the stolen funds, the fraudulent loan applications, all of it added up to felony charges that could put her in prison for decades. But I wasn't ready to involve law enforcement just yet. First, I needed to understand the full scope of what she had done and figure out how to protect what remained of our family's assets. I also needed to confront Marcus and give him one chance to explain his role in this nightmare before I destroyed his life along with Sandra's. The confrontation happened on a cold Thursday morning in November. I called Marcus and asked him to meet me at the old family diner, where Robert and I used to take him for pancakes when he was little. I chose that location deliberately because I wanted him to remember who he used to be before Sandra twisted him into someone I barely recognized. He arrived 15 minutes late, looking nervous and distracted. His hair was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, and he had dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. When he sat down across from me in that familiar red vinyl booth, I could see guilt written all over his face. For the first few minutes, we made awkward small talk about the weather and the kids, but I hadn't asked him there to discuss his children's school activities. I had come to give him one last opportunity to tell me the truth about what he and Sandra had been doing with our family's money. When I finally asked him directly about the missing funds, his reaction told me everything I needed to know. He couldn't meet my eyes. His hands started shaking, and he began stammering out excuses that contradicted each other within the same sentence. He claimed he didn't know anything about unauthorized withdrawals, then immediately started explaining why those withdrawals had been necessary for business operations. The worst part was listening to him try to justify Sandra's actions by repeating her lies about my mental health. He actually sat there in that diner booth and told me, his own mother, that he had been worried about my decision-making abilities for months. He said Sandra had been protecting the family business from my increasingly erratic behavior. When I produced copies of the fraudulent medical reports that Sandra had used to steal our money, Marcus went completely pale. His mouth opened and closed several times like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. He knew he had been caught, and there was no explanation that could make any of this acceptable. I gave him one final chance to do the right thing. I told him that if he helped me recover the stolen funds and testified against Sandra's fraudulent activities, I would consider not pressing charges against him personally. I emphasized that he was my son, and despite everything that had happened, I still loved him enough to offer him a way out of the legal nightmare that was about to destroy his life. His response broke my heart in ways I didn't think were possible after everything I had already endured. Instead of showing remorse or gratitude for my offer of mercy, he became defensive and angry. He accused me of trying to destroy his marriage and tear apart his family. He said Sandra had been nothing but good to me over the years, and I was being vindictive and unreasonable. But the final blow came when he looked me straight in the eye and said that maybe it would be better for everyone if I just accepted that I was getting too old to handle business responsibilities. He suggested that I should be grateful that Sandra was willing to take care of everything so I could focus on enjoying my retirement years. In that moment, sitting in the diner where I had spent countless Saturday mornings watching my little boy devour chocolate chip pancakes and tell me about his dreams for the future, I realized that the son I had raised was gone. The man sitting across from me was a stranger who had chosen money and a manipulative wife over his own mother. I left that diner knowing that I was truly alone in this fight. Sandra had not only stolen our money, she had stolen my son's soul in the process. But she had made one critical mistake in her elaborate scheme. She had underestimated a 68-year-old widow who had spent 4 decades learning how to protect what mattered most. That afternoon, I drove straight to the office of Sarah Mitchell, the most ruthless attorney in our city. Sarah had a reputation for taking on cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch and winning settlements that her clients never thought possible. She specialized in elder abuse cases and had successfully prosecuted dozens of financial exploitation schemes over her 20-year career. When I walked into Sarah's office with my boxes of evidence, her eyes lit up like a prosecutor who had just been handed a confession. She spent 3 hours reviewing the documents Mr. Peterson and I had compiled, asking detailed questions about Sandra's behavior patterns and the timeline of Robert's hospitalization. By the end of our meeting, Sarah was practically vibrating with excitement. She told me this was one of the most comprehensive financial fraud cases she had ever seen, with evidence so clear and damaging that Sandra wouldn't be able to bargain her way out of serious prison time. But Sarah also warned me about what pursuing this case would mean for my family relationships. Prosecuting Sandra would inevitably destroy her marriage to Marcus, potentially leave my grandchildren without a mother, and create a permanent rift in our family that could never be repaired. I looked Sarah straight in the eye and told her that Sandra had already destroyed our family the moment she decided to forge medical documents and steal from a grieving widow. My grandchildren deserved to know the truth about what kind of person their mother really was, and Marcus needed to face the consequences of his choices. That night, I sat in Robert's favorite chair in our living room, looking at the family photos that lined the mantelpiece. Pictures of birthdays and holidays, graduations and anniversaries, all the moments that had seemed so precious when they were happening. Now they felt like evidence of a life that had been built on lies and manipulation. I thought about calling Sandra to give her one last chance to return the money and avoid criminal prosecution. Part of me still remembered the young woman who had married my son 15 years ago, who had seemed so grateful to be welcomed into our family, who had promised to love and honor the values that Robert and I had spent our lives building. But then I remembered her voice in that hospital hallway, the coldness in her eyes when she thought I wasn't capable of making decisions about my own husband's care. I remembered the forged documents, the stolen money, and the systematic way she had worked to erase me from my own family's legacy. Sandra had made her choice when she decided that my kindness was weakness and my trust was stupidity. Now it was time for her to learn what happened when you tried to destroy a woman who had spent 7 decades learning how to survive in a world that didn't always value her strength. The next morning, I called Sarah and told her to file every charge that the evidence would support. I wanted Sandra prosecuted for fraud, theft, forgery, and elder abuse. I wanted her assets frozen, her credit destroyed, and her freedom taken away for as long as the law would allow. But criminal charges were just the beginning of my plan. While Sarah worked on building the prosecution case, I started implementing my own form of justice. You see, Sandra's secret business venture that she had been funding with our stolen money was still operating under the assumption that the cash flow would continue indefinitely. She had committed our company to several major construction projects without my knowledge, projects that required substantial upfront investments and ongoing operational funding. Her brother Derek had been hiring subcontractors, ordering materials, and making promises to clients based on Sandra's assurance that the money would always be available. What Sandra didn't realize was that I still had certain legal rights and financial authorities that she hadn't managed to steal from me. While she had restricted my access to the operating accounts, I still maintained control over our primary business insurance policies, our bonding capacity, and several key vendor relationships that were essential for any major construction work. On a bright Monday morning in December, I started making phone calls that would bring Sandra's house of cards crashing down around her. I canceled our insurance coverage for any projects not directly overseen by me personally. I revoked our bonding agreements for work being performed by unauthorized subcontractors. I contacted every major supplier in our region and informed them that any materials delivered to Sandra's projects would not be paid for by our company. Within 48 hours, Sandra's phone was ringing constantly with panicked calls from subcontractors, suppliers, and clients who were demanding explanations for why work had suddenly stopped on multiple job sites. Her brother Derek was facing thousands of dollars in personal liability for materials that had been delivered but would never be paid for. But the real satisfaction came when I received a frantic call from Sandra herself. Her voice was shaking with barely controlled panic as she demanded to know what I thought I was doing. She accused me of sabotaging legitimate business operations and threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent if I didn't reverse my actions immediately. I let her rant for several minutes before I spoke. When I finally responded, my voice was calm and steady in a way that clearly terrified her, more than shouting would have. I told her that I knew about every stolen dollar, every forged document, and every lie she had told to banks and business partners over the past year. Then I informed her that criminal charges had already been filed, that her assets were being frozen, and that she had approximately 72 hours before law enforcement would be arriving at her door with arrest warrants. The silence on the other end of the line was so complete that I wondered if she had hung up. But then I heard something that made all the pain and betrayal of the past months feel worth it. I heard Sandra crying, not the manipulative tears she had used to control my son and deceive business partners, but the genuine sobs of a woman who had finally realized that her victims weren't as helpless as she had assumed. When she finally spoke again, her voice was small and desperate. She offered to return the money, to dissolve her secret business, to do anything I wanted if I would just make this all go away. She promised that she and Marcus would leave town, that I would never have to see them again, that she would sign over her rights to everything if I would just not press charges. But it was far too late for bargaining. Sandra had spent months systematically destroying my life, my family, and my husband's legacy. She had stolen from a grieving widow, forged medical documents, and turned my own son against me. The time for mercy had passed. The moment she decided that my love and generosity made me an easy target, I told her that she would face the full consequences of her actions, that every stolen dollar would be repaid with interest, and that she would serve every day of prison time that the law allowed. Then I hung up the phone and sat back in Robert's chair, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced since that terrible night in the hospital. The next few days brought a cascade of consequences that exceeded even my expectations for justice. Sandra's business collapse was swift and total, leaving her brother Derek facing personal bankruptcy and several clients pursuing lawsuits for breach of contract. The criminal investigation expanded as authorities discovered that Sandra's fraudulent activities had affected multiple families and businesses throughout our community. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a call from Marcus, sobbing and begging me to help Sandra avoid prison time. He promised that he would do anything, pay anything, say anything, if I would just show mercy to the mother of his children. I listened to my son beg for the woman who had systematically destroyed our family, and I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. He had made his choice when he decided to help Sandra steal from his own mother. Now he would live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of his life. The phone call ended with me telling Marcus exactly what Sandra had told me. In that hospital hallway, I said that he and Sandra weren't family anymore, that they should stay out of my life, and that I would be withdrawing all financial support from people who had proven they couldn't be trusted with my generosity. As I hung up that phone, I realized that Sandra had actually given me a gift in the end. She had shown me exactly who I could trust and who I couldn't. She had freed me from the burden of supporting people who saw my love as weakness and my kindness as opportunity. The woman who had tried to destroy me had accidentally created the strongest version of myself I had ever been. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning, exactly 11 days after I had made those final phone calls that brought Sandra's illegal empire crashing down. I was sitting in my kitchen, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper like I had done every morning for the past 40 years when I heard the sirens approaching my neighborhood. At first, I assumed it was just another medical emergency. Our street had several elderly residents, and ambulances weren't uncommon. But as the sound grew closer and then stopped right in front of the house 3 doors down from mine, I realized this wasn't a medical call at all. Through my kitchen window, I watched as 2 police cars and an unmarked sedan pulled up to the modest 2-story home that Marcus and Sandra had moved into after selling their previous house to fund her secret business venture. I set down my coffee cup and moved to my front porch, wanting to get a better view of what was unfolding. The officers who emerged from those vehicles moved with the kind of purposeful efficiency that told me this wasn't a routine visit. They had arrest warrants, search warrants, and the confidence of law enforcement officers who knew they had an airtight case. Detective Rodriguez, who had been leading the investigation into Sandra's financial crimes, stepped out of the unmarked car with a folder thick enough to contain months of evidence. What happened next was exactly what I had been waiting for since that terrible night in the hospital, when Sandra had shown me her true nature. The front door opened, and Sandra appeared in her bathrobe, her hair disheveled from sleep, her face confused and frightened. Even from 3 houses away, I could see the exact moment when she realized that her carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation was about to come crashing down around her. Detective Rodriguez approached her with the arrest warrant, and I watched Sandra's face cycle through a range of emotions that would have been almost comical if the situation weren't so serious. First came disbelief, then anger, then a desperate kind of panic as she realized that all her threats about having me declared mentally incompetent had been empty bluster. The neighbors began emerging from their houses, drawn by the unusual activity on our normally quiet street. Mrs. Henderson, from next door to Sandra, stood on her front steps in her housecoat, craning her neck to get a better view. The Johnson family across the street had gathered on their front lawn, whispering among themselves about what could possibly be happening. I remained on my porch, perfectly visible to anyone who cared to look, and I made no effort to hide my satisfaction at what was unfolding. For months, Sandra had been telling these same neighbors that I was becoming increasingly confused and paranoid, that my accusations against her were the product of age-related mental decline. She had painted herself as the long-suffering daughter-in-law who was nobly caring for a difficult, elderly woman. Now, those same neighbors were watching as she was arrested for elder abuse, fraud, and theft. The irony was so perfect that I almost started laughing right there on my front porch. Marcus emerged from the house just as the officers were placing handcuffs on his wife. He was fully dressed, which told me he had been awake and probably expecting this moment for days. His face was pale, his movements jerky and uncertain, like a man who had been living in fear of exactly this scenario. I watched him try to approach Sandra, probably to offer some kind of comfort or reassurance, but the officers kept him at a distance while they completed the arrest procedure. Sandra was crying now, not the manipulative tears she had used so effectively to control people, but genuine sobs of a woman who had finally been caught and knew there was no way out. Detective Rodriguez spent several minutes explaining Sandra's rights and the charges against her. Even from my distance, I could see Sandra shaking her head repeatedly, probably still trying to deny the overwhelming evidence that had led to this moment. She kept looking around desperately, as if searching for some escape route or some ally who might intervene on her behalf. Her eyes found me standing on my porch, and for a long moment, we stared at each other across the distance that separated our houses. In that look, I saw the exact moment when Sandra finally understood that I hadn't been the confused, helpless, old woman she had assumed I was. She realized that every move she had made had been anticipated, that every lie she had told had been documented, and that every dollar she had stolen had been traced. The fear in her eyes was replaced by something that looked almost like respect, a grudging acknowledgement that she had severely underestimated her opponent. But it was far too late for that recognition to do her any good. The handcuffs were already in place. The charges had been filed, and her future was now in the hands of a legal system that took elder abuse very seriously. As the officers led Sandra toward the patrol car, she stumbled slightly, and Marcus moved forward to steady her. But she shrugged away from his touch, her face twisted with an anger that seemed directed more at him than at the situation itself. I realized in that moment that Sandra blamed Marcus for their downfall, probably convinced that his weakness and guilt had somehow contributed to her exposure. The neighbors continued to gather, their whispered conversations growing louder as more details became clear. Someone mentioned seeing police cars at Sandra's brother Derek's house earlier that morning, suggesting that his arrest had probably already taken place. The scope of the investigation was becoming apparent to everyone who was watching, and I could see the shock on faces of people who had known Sandra for years. Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down approached my porch as the police cars drove away with Sandra in custody. She was one of the neighbors who had always been friendly with Sandra, often praising her devotion to family and her business acumen. Now she looked confused and slightly embarrassed, as if she couldn't reconcile the woman she thought she knew with the criminal who had just been arrested. She asked me directly if I knew what the charges were about, and I could see in her eyes that she was beginning to connect Sandra's arrest with the stories Sandra had been spreading about my declining mental health. I explained calmly that Sandra had been stealing money from our family business and had forged medical documents to cover her tracks. The look of understanding that spread across Mrs. Patterson's face was deeply satisfying. She apologized immediately for any doubts she might have had about my competence, admitting that Sandra had been very convincing when she described my supposed confusion and erratic behavior. She said she had actually been worried about me living alone and had considered suggesting that Marcus and Sandra move in to take care of me. I thanked her for her concern, but assured her that I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself. I also mentioned that anyone who had questions about my mental competence was welcome to speak with my attorney, my doctor, or the detective who had been investigating Sandra's crimes. The evidence would show clearly who had been confused and who had been calculating. As Mrs. Patterson walked back to her house, I noticed several other neighbors watching our conversation with obvious interest. Word was spreading quickly through our small community about what had really been happening behind the scenes of what everyone had assumed was a normal family situation. The next few hours brought a steady stream of phone calls from people who had heard about Sandra's arrest. Some were neighbors expressing shock and offering support. Others were business associates who wanted to understand how Sandra's crimes might affect ongoing projects or financial obligations. But the most significant call came from Detective Rodriguez himself, who wanted to update me on the progress of the investigation. He explained that Sandra's arrest had been coordinated with simultaneous raids on her brother Derek's home and business, as well as the offices of the shell companies she had been using to launder stolen money. The evidence they had recovered during these searches exceeded even their expectations. Sandra had been meticulous in documenting her criminal activities, apparently believing that her elaborate web of lies would protect her indefinitely. Her computer files contained detailed records of every fraudulent transaction, every forged document, and every lie she had told to banks, insurance companies, and business partners. Detective Rodriguez said the district attorney's office was already preparing charges that would likely result in a prison sentence of 15 to 20 years. The sheer scope of Sandra's financial crimes, combined with the vulnerability of her primary victim, made this exactly the kind of case that prosecutors love to take to trial. But perhaps most satisfying was his report on the collapse of Sandra's secret construction business. Without the steady flow of stolen money from our family company, her brother Derek had been unable to meet payroll, pay suppliers, or complete contracted work. The business had folded completely within a week, leaving Derek facing personal bankruptcy and multiple lawsuits from angry clients. The workers who had been employed by Sandra's company were now unemployed just before the holidays, and several families were facing financial hardship because of paychecks that would never come. Suppliers who had extended credit based on Sandra's fraudulent financial statements were looking at significant losses that might force some of them out of business entirely. Detective Rodriguez assured me that the investigation would continue until every stolen dollar was accounted for and every victim was identified. He said Sandra's crimes had created a ripple effect throughout the construction industry in our region, affecting dozens of businesses and hundreds of workers who had trusted her representations. The detective also mentioned that Marcus was cooperating fully with the investigation, providing testimony and documentation that would help ensure Sandra received the maximum possible sentence. He said my son seemed genuinely remorseful about his role in the crimes and was desperate to find some way to make amends for the damage he had helped cause. But I felt no sympathy for Marcus's belated remorse. He had made his choice when he decided to help Sandra steal from his own mother, and now he would have to live with the consequences of that decision. His cooperation with law enforcement might help him avoid criminal charges, but it wouldn't repair the relationship he had destroyed or restore the trust he had betrayed. That evening, as I sat in Robert's chair, reviewing the financial statements that showed exactly how much money Sandra had stolen, I received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Mitchell, my attorney, arrived at my door with a bottle of champagne and a smile that could have powered the entire neighborhood. She had just received word from the district attorney's office that Sandra's case was being fast-tracked for prosecution. The evidence was so overwhelming and the crimes so clear-cut that they expected to have her in prison within 6 months. The civil recovery case was also proceeding ahead of schedule, with Sandra's assets already frozen and her brother Derek's business accounts seized pending liquidation. Sarah explained that Sandra's arrest had sent shockwaves through the legal community because of the sophistication of her fraud scheme and the brazenness of her attacks on an elderly victim. Several other attorneys had already contacted Sarah's office, representing clients who believed they might have been victimized by similar schemes involving Sandra or her associates. The most gratifying news was that Sandra's lawyer had already approached the prosecutor about a plea deal, suggesting that she was ready to admit guilt in exchange for a reduced sentence. But the district attorney had made it clear that given the severity of the crimes and the vulnerability of the victim, no plea bargain would be considered that didn't include significant prison time. As Sarah and I shared that champagne, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I had been a grieving widow who trusted the wrong people and nearly lost everything my husband and I had worked our entire lives to build. Tonight, I was a woman who had fought back against those who tried to destroy her and had emerged victorious in every way that mattered. Sandra was in jail, facing decades in prison for her crimes. Her secret business had collapsed, taking her brother's financial future with it. Marcus was living with the knowledge that his greed and weakness had cost him his relationship with his mother and his children's respect. The money Sandra had stolen was being recovered through asset seizures and insurance claims. But more importantly, I had learned something valuable about my own strength and resilience. I had discovered that being kind and generous didn't make me weak, and that being elderly didn't make me helpless. I had proven to myself and to everyone who had underestimated me that a woman with experience, intelligence, and determination could overcome even the most elaborate schemes designed to destroy her. The neighborhood was quiet now, the excitement of the morning's arrest having settled into the kind of whispered conversations that would continue for weeks. But I knew that Sandra's downfall was just the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one where I would never again allow anyone to mistake my kindness for weakness or my trust for naivety. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at the family photos that still lined my mantelpiece. But now they told a different story. They were no longer reminders of relationships built on lies and manipulation. They were evidence of the values and principles that Robert and I had tried to instill in our family. Values that some people had chosen to abandon, but that I would continue to uphold. The phone rang one final time before I turned in for the night. It was Marcus, calling from a number I didn't recognize, probably because Sandra's arrest had made him afraid to use his regular phone. His voice was broken, desperate, pleading for forgiveness and understanding that I was not prepared to give. He begged me to consider the impact that Sandra's imprisonment would have on his children, my grandchildren, who would now grow up knowing their mother was a convicted felon. He promised that he would do anything to make amends, that he would spend the rest of his life trying to earn back my trust and love. But I had heard these promises before, in that diner booth where he had chosen Sandra's lies over his mother's truth. I had listened to his excuses and justifications for months, while Sandra systematically stole from our family. His remorse now felt as calculated and manipulative as everything else that had happened over the past year. I told Marcus the same thing Sandra had told me in that hospital hallway, the words that had started this entire chain of events. I said that he wasn't family anymore, that he should stay out of my life, and that I was withdrawing all support from people who had proven they couldn't be trusted. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for almost a minute before Marcus finally spoke again. His voice was barely a whisper when he said he understood, that he knew he had lost the right to call me mother when he had chosen to help Sandra destroy everything our family had built together. When I hung up that phone, I felt the final pieces of my old life falling away, making room for whatever came next. I was 68 years old, financially secure, legally vindicated, and completely free from the people who had tried to take advantage of my generosity and love. Sandra's attempt to destroy me had instead destroyed herself, her marriage, her business, her freedom, and her future. The woman who had told me I wasn't family had discovered exactly what happened when you declared war on someone who had spent 7 decades learning how to survive and thrive in a world that didn't always appreciate her strength. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I smiled, thinking about Sandra, spending her first night in a jail cell, probably still unable to believe that the confused old woman she had tried to manipulate had orchestrated her complete and total downfall. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight I would sleep peacefully, knowing that justice had been served, and that the people who had betrayed me were finally facing the consequences of their choices. The war Sandra had started when she decided to steal from a grieving widow was over, and she had lost in every way that mattered. Every way that mattered. Sometimes life teaches you lessons in ways you never expect. When Sandra screamed at me in that hospital hallway, telling me I wasn't family and to stay out, she thought she was pushing away a weak old woman who would quietly disappear from her life. What she actually did was awaken something in me that had been sleeping for far too long. You see, for years I had confused being kind with being weak, being generous with being foolish. I thought that love meant giving people everything they wanted, even when what they wanted was to take advantage of me. Sandra helped me understand that real strength sometimes means knowing when to stop giving and start protecting yourself. The 11 days it took for her business to collapse taught me something important about the difference between building something legitimate and creating something based on lies and stolen money. When you build on a foundation of deception, everything crumbles the moment someone removes the support you never earned in the first place. Sandra is now serving 15 years in federal prison. Her brother Derek lost everything and had to move back in with his elderly parents. Marcus lost his wife, his business, and his relationship with his mother, all in the same month. The grandchildren I once spoiled with love and gifts now visit me supervised by social services twice a month, and they ask questions about their mother that I answer honestly but gently. As for me, I've learned to live for myself again. I travel when I want to. I spend my money on things that bring me joy. And I've made new friends who value me for who I am, rather than what I can give them. The construction business is thriving under new management, managed by people who earn their positions through competence rather than manipulation. The most important thing I learned is that when someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. Sandra showed me exactly who she was that night in the hospital, and I'm grateful I finally had the wisdom to listen. If you found value in my story, I'd appreciate your support by liking this video and subscribing to hear more stories like mine. And please, share your thoughts in the comments below about what you would have done in my situation. Until next time, remember that being kind doesn't mean being weak, and protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary.